still not going to pull all-nighters. My last all-nighter, I think, was in my 20s. I can't do it anymore. Okay, today I want to talk about some changes that are outside politics, right? So we talked about the second party system before, right? And the second party system is Democrats versus Whigs. And this textbook is not fantastic about the party system, as you guys, the ones of you who tried to do that question or did that question probably noticed that there wasn't a whole lot about the Democrats versus Whigs. But the Democratic, the thing about each of those parties, I think that's important to understand, is that they are patchwork coalitions that were designed to contain sectional tensions. So Southern farmers and urban workers are in the Democratic Party, whereas Northern merchants and the very wealthiest Southern planters tended to be Whigs, right? So slaveholders, some of the very wealthiest slaveholders tended to be in the Whig Party. Some of the Southern, just plain old Southern farmers and Southern slaveholders, the smaller slaveholders, tended to be in the Democratic Party. And then we have, Democrats being mostly Irish urban workers, Whigs being mostly Northern merchants. So after the Denmark-Vesey, we see a few things that happen. Southern states become more obsessed with states' rights and try to limit literacy and to make it actually a felony in some southern states to teach enslaved people to read. There's also a gag rule that's imposed in Congress that prevents anyone from bringing up slavery. So that if a church sends a petition to Congress saying that slavery should be abolished, there's a gag rule in Congress that prevents Congress from even discussing this. Okay? There's some other things that happen. Oh, good. Excellent. Right? So the gag rule is an important thing. Another important thing is the mails. And I'm not sure if this is discussed, but one of the things that Jackson does is he controls the Postmaster General, and Jackson allows the Postmaster General to basically seize mails that have anti-slavery literature in it and burn it. Okay, so one thing about mail is the way the mail system worked in the United States in the 19th century is any newspapers or magazines that were sent over the mail were sent free, and any letters you'd have to pay for. And so letters basically subsidized the free distribution of newspapers and magazines. But that also meant that you could open up the magazine or the newspaper and look inside, right? So the postmaster could see what was being sent. If you put a magazine in a package, then it would be charged. There'd be a charge for it. But if you sent magazines without a package, it went free. So some northern anti-slavery societies sent anti-slavery newspapers, anti-slavery magazines, and stuff like that in the South. One of the things that Andrew Jackson, as president, does is prevent those, allow the Postmaster General to basically seize those things and burn them so they don't get to the South. Okay, so this is the strangeness of this region. We see a sort of growing tension between North and South over slavery. No, he just looked at the titles, and so although postmasters might have had a lot of time, there were political appointees, but the postmaster in a region would just so there were things like the Quaker anti-slavery zodiac that would be sent out. Farmer's Almanac. So an anti, what a Farmer's Almanac is? Do you guys get Farmer's Almanacs? They still have them in the like 7-Elevens and Piggly Wigglies and things like that, which have the seasons and when the best time to grow dates is and things like that. The phases of the moon is in a Farmer's Almanac. Lots of farmers read Farmer's Almanacs. There were anti-slavery Farmer's Almanacs. Oh, your dad gets one every year. Excellent. Georgia is still a farm place, right? And so those farmers' almanacs were sent for free by Quakers, but they had anti-slavery messages in them. Oh, okay, right. So farmers' almanacs were the most, besides the Bible, that was the most popular thing that you'd see in a home in the 19th century. And so people sent out anti-slavery farmers' almanacs, and the postmaster would burn them. Because again, people wanted the almanac, but then they would have verses in them about how horrible slavery was and things like that. So there are real tensions between North and South over slavery, and those are growing tensions. Even as the political system of Democrats and Whigs tries to basically stamp that out, to basically not prevent anyone from talking about these issues. Okay? So between the period 1800 and 1830, we see steamboats emerge, steamboats that can go up and down the Mississippi River, so that traffic doesn't just go south on the Mississippi River. Traffic can go north up the Mississippi River, so you can send wheat or flour or cotton or other things down the Mississippi River and then bring your money back up on the boats. You don't have to take the Natchez Trace anymore. We also see a few railroads emerging, but not that many. And so from 1800 to 1830, what we see is a lot of canals and rivers that are improved to make travel better. There's also paved roads and these sorts of things. And so travel distances, travel times from 1800 to 1830, particularly in the north, as you'll see, these are times from New York, increase rapidly. So travel times decrease. So it takes less time to get further and further into the backcountry. One way, starting around 1830, that certain towns try to improve their connections to the West are with railroads. And railroads are basically monopoly corridors. They run along rivers. This is Philadelphia's Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, which is supposed to connect Philadelphia back to the West. Now, we talked about what railroads are supposed to do. Why would, if you're a merchant in Philadelphia, what's the attraction of building a railroad? Why would you want to build a railroad that goes out of your town to the West? Tourism, maybe, yeah. Transporting materials, okay, good. So if you right, and supplies. So you're going to supply. It opens up new markets for you as a merchant. So you can send supplies to the West and not exactly exports because it's still inside the country, but basically, yeah, you can take your the plows that you make or buy and send them further to the West. You can needles, thread, all those other sorts of things. Further settlement and expansion, and then those people are going to send their grain back to you for resale and turning it into flour and things like that. So by 1857, we see travel rates improve drastically, largely because of railroads. So the canal era goes up to the 1830s and 1840s, but the latter part, so from 1845 to say 1850, we're talking really about railroads now that are fostering further settlement. And we start to see cities creating their own hinterland, as it's called, by stretching back to regions further into the West. Because of Gibbons versus Ogden, remember Gibbons versus Ogden is that decision that that says that the federal government sets the law, but if the federal government doesn't set the law, then the states have the ability to set laws, right? So federal law trumps state law, but state laws get to make decisions if there is no federal legislation. And so railroads tend to be state railroads, right? So railroads, relatively few of them extend across state lines. This image is from 1860 when we start to see some trunk lines emerging. But in general, most of the railroads are inside state lines at first. Okay. Now I want to talk about linkages. And this is a sort of economic and geographical term. Possibly. Let's see. Let me think about this. Boston to Detroit. Yes, you would go over the Great Lakes, and probably not. If you went from Boston to Detroit, you would probably take a railroad in, let's say, in the 1830s or 1840s, in to New York, and then you take another. You might take the Erie Canal to Lake Ontario, and then Lake Erie, and so as a result, you probably wouldn't have to pass through Toronto, and Montreal, both, while they have customs regulations, they basically ignore them. So they are, particularly when it comes to goods flowing into Canada from the United States. And so lots of people and tourists, both Toronto and Montreal, are given grief by the British government for not actually paying much attention to customs and things like that. This is one of the reasons that this is an unpoliced border still, or relative, like a border that doesn't have a whole lot of fences and things like that, is in part because there was a whole lot of trade back and forth. Yeah, they weren't that strict. In fact, Toronto makes its wealth in part by not being very strict at all. Okay, so I want to talk about linkages today, and this is not discussed in the textbook, but I think it's an important for understanding the tensions between North and South that are going to merge in the 1840s and 1850s. Linkages are basically that relationship between a city on the coast and its hinterland. Um, so cities create their own hinterlands by building these railroads into the west. Um, and places like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston fund huge railroad projects, mostly funded by merchants who want to be able to establish direct ties between the countryside and their cities. Eastern cities, which have been losing ground before 1830, start to really pick up steam and become very, very. Their populations grow really quickly after 1830, in large part because of railroads. The B&O opens up with 13 miles of track in 1830. By 1860, so in the United States, there's 13 miles of track in 1830. By 1860, there are 31,000 miles of railroad tracks. Okay, and now we shouldn't overestimate railroads because it was still cheaper to go by canal and steamboat. So until the 1850s, more traffic went by canal and steamboat than went by rail. But railroads are important, and what they produce are kind of linkages in terms of economic development. So what does that mean? So there are things called backward linkages and forward linkages connected to the crop that's grown in the backcountry. Okay, so if we look at the wheat belt, which is that region, let's see, can you see my cursor? You can't. That the line that's going kind of catty corner, or what's that? So the straight line you see on that image is is cotton, and this line up here, the I don't know what kind of, the line that's sort of bent, is the wheat belt. And so the wheat belt extends mostly through the north, although it does include Virginia here, and Missouri, and where else? Indiana, Illinois, and a little bit of western Kentucky. So the wheat is not just exclusively in the north. Wheat is north and south, but there's more of it in the north than in the south. So some things about wheat. Oh, so hinterland is the backwoods. So the hinterland of, you might say that the hinterland of Athens is, so the hinterland of Atlanta is a better choice. The hinterland of Atlanta is all the other counties around Atlanta that where people go to do their shopping and stuff like that. So what people in the counties around Atlanta are the more, or kind of the suburbs. That's the hinterland of Atlanta. Atlanta itself, the city center, is the core, and so the hinterland is a sort of rural place. In our context, that would be all the area east, all the area west of Philadelphia, all the area west of Boston, all the area west of Richmond are the hinterlands. There are a few cities in the backcountry, but by and large, they serve as the hinterland, the backland, behindland for those big cities. Okay, and so if you need to look at what's being produced in the hinterland, what's being produced in that backwoods, and what's being produced in the backwoods in most of the northern regions is wheat. And the backward linkages are the things that are used to produce wheat that any merchant is going to sell. Sorry, so merchants who are going to trade in the back country, who are going to set up stores in the back country, who are going to try to sell goods to farmers in the West, are going to sell plows and nails and fertilizer and clothing, right? Those are all the things that a farmer needs and a farm family needs to grow wheat. So you need plows, you need nails, you need fertilizer, you need clothing. All those things are things that are necessities that are going to be provided by the city. And the city is this. So merchants in, say, Boston or Philadelphia are going to set up stores and shops further and further west to sell those goods. And so they make their money from the backward linkages, the things that go into making that crop. Right? The forward linkages are the things that the crop then can be used to do. Right? So you take wheat, and what do? You buy and sell wheat on what are called the exchanges. Basically, this is what an exchange looks like. This image on the right, where people buy and sell wheat for people who are going to use them in mills. Another forward linkage is a flour mill that takes wheat and turns it into flour. Another forward linkage are bakeries and distilleries, which take then that flour and turn it into baked goods, or that take grain and turn it into liquor, that take wheat and hops and turn it into beer. Likewise, restaurants are the final forward linkage, where you take, the flour mill produces the flour, the bakery turns the flour into bread, and the bread is served in a restaurant. All those are forward linkages to wheat, things that the wheat can do that can be further refined in the city. Okay, so the attraction for a merchant in Boston or Philadelphia, the reason they invest in railroads is for those backward and forward linkages. They want to be able to sell goods to the farmers in the West, and they want to be able to process those goods for resale in the cities. Backward linkages, anything that you use to grow a crop, right? So that's the thing behind the wheat. So a plow or a nail that's used to make your why would you use nails? You need nails to build your farm, to build your barn, to build all these other sorts of things. You can't produce nails on your own. You have to buy the nails from the city. Fertilizer is something that's going to come from the east. It's somebody's going to harvest bat guano on an island in the Atlantic, ship the bat guano in big barrels, and send the bat guano out to a farmer in west of Philadelphia, which they're going to use to apply to their crops for growing wheat or other goods. But also clothing, because you need to be wearing clothing when you're farming. I mean, you can farm without clothes, but most people, these are necessities. Backward linkages are necessities for producing wheat, whereas forward linkages are things that you can turn wheat into. Does that make sense? Okay, so those are backward and forward linkages. Why does this matter? Well, I want to understand basically how people become, what other types of foods would be backward linkages. There'd be salt would be a backward linkage, because you need salt on a farm. Anything you need on a farm to grow the stuff is a backward linkage, effectively. So, you could, almost anything that a farmer needs is effectively a backward linkage, I guess. Salt, plow, nails, fertilizer, clothing, thread, what else? Maybe cotton shirting and stuff like that you use to make your clothes on a pattern. All those things end up being backward linkages because everybody needs them. Okay? And so that's what heats up cities, right? What heats up the cities, makes them more populous, and makes wealth in those cities are the backward and forward linkages for the crops that are grown in the West. So when we think about industry in the United States and the industry in the North, we need to recognize that all that industry depends on farms. that it cannot exist without farms. 80 to 90% of Americans in the 19th century are farmers, and those farmers are need goods to produce the stuff. Families that are farms in the West, and they're also those goods, those farm products that are produced are going to be turned into something else in cities. So cities depend really intimately and strongly on farms in that way. And to give you a sense of this, I want to talk a little bit about Benjamin Franklin Newcomer, to give you a sense of how wealth is generated in these cities and how people become wealthy. And Benjamin Franklin Newcomer is one of the richest people in the United States by the 1840s and 1850s. And I want to give you a sense of why he goes from being this is a painting of him in his 30s. This is him in his 50s. This is him in his 70s. And by the time he's in his 60s on the right, and by the time he's in his 60s, he's one of the wealthiest men in Baltimore. Okay, so some of the greatest fortunes in Baltimore are come from specializing in the forward linkages in the crops that are produced. So Newcomer's father starts out as a general merchant. And in 1842, the Newcomer family forms a relationship with Newcomer and this guy Stonebreaker. And Newcomer and Stonebreaker are by 1842 are wholesale dealers in flour and grain. So initially, in the 1830s, when Newcomer's a kid, the family is basically a general merchant. Basically, they operate a store. They sell goods to other stores, things like that. By 1842, they are wholesale dealers in flour and grain. All they deal with is flour and grain. They no longer sell the nails. They no longer sell the backward linkages. They're just specializing in the forward linkages, and they buy grain in large quantities. The place that Newcomer and Stonebreaker operate is on is they basically send folks out into the backcountry. They buy their grain, and then they ship it into Baltimore, and then Newcomer will then find places to process the grain and turn it into flour, and then sell it to other people. So Newcomer works in this. Benjamin Franklin Newcomer works in this starting at age 16, and the Newcomers learn to do basically grain and flour. That's all they deal with by the 1840s. Before that, they dealt in everything. After that, they deal just in grain and flour. They specialize. The Newcomers learn everything there is to know about grain and flour: how weather will affect the crop, where the best grains come from, when prices are highest and when they're lowest. They're highest 9 months after the harvest. They're lowest immediately after the harvest, when lots and lots of people have grain to sell. But there's a lot of other things that they know. They know about whether wet weather is going to produce the Hessian fly that's going to eat up crops. They know which areas in Western Maryland and this is in Baltimore, which areas in Western Maryland are going to do well and not, because they're traveling back and forth. They work 2 seasons, winter and fall wheat, and they come from different regions west of Maryland. Winter wheat is basically is planted over the winter. Fall wheat is planted basically over the fall. And for many years, they sold 10% of all the flour that was sold in Baltimore. By 1845, Benjamin Franklin Newcomer, at age 18, buys his father's interest and buys Stonebreaker's interest. At 21, he marries one of the earliest stockholders and directors of the B&O. So this rags to riches story depends on marrying well. So just FYI, if you're looking for a route to wealth, this is marrying well turns out to be a really good one. So he marries the daughter of one of the earliest stockholders and directors of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a railroad that he regularly had traveled over to engage in the grain trade. And connections through her give the Newcomer family access to other merchants and bankers in Baltimore. She puts on parties. They visit the opera and charity balls. The family is now quite wealthy, and Benjamin Franklin Newcomer promotes this thing called the Corn and Flour Exchange in 1853. It becomes one of the most important mercantile institutions in Baltimore. The Corn and Flour Exchange is where people who are millers, who are going to take grain and turn it into flour, and other dealers who are in the West are going to come and buy and sell wheat by the bag. And they're going to buy and sell it with basically, buy and sell it by the truckful. So they're going to sell large quantities of this, and there's going to be a kind of increasingly standard quality of grain that's going to be traded, and people will buy tens, hundreds, even thousands of bags of grain. They'll also buy grain from people who can promise grain but haven't yet delivered it. So someone who can promise that he's going to have 200 or 300 bags of grain, will come to the Corn and Flour Exchange and say, I will have this much grain in 2 months, and sell basically a receipt for future grain to someone else. And then at the end of, and then 2 months later, when the grain is supposed to come in, he'll deliver it. And that receipt, basically a promise to pay for that grain, will trade hands multiple times in the Corn and Flour Exchange, as people will buy and sell it expecting that prices are going to go up and down. And so Newcomer goes from being someone who's trading in grain for someone who sets up basically a bank for grain, which is the Corn and Flour Exchange. This is where the wealthiest people in Baltimore come to. They are looking for future flour prices. They're looking for future grain prices. People who are setting up mills in Baltimore are going to buy their grain here, and they're going to buy it months in advance. And here's where other people's money goes to speculation on flour and future prices. So you buy a contract to get grain, say 2 months from now, from a dealer who has multiple farmers locked up. In 2 months, if the price goes up, you can sell it to a flour milling company for a profit. If the price is going to go down, you might sell it quickly before the price goes down. And so it looks similar to gambling, but it brings in money to bear on the grain prices. And as Newcomer knows, the real money comes from not playing on this grain exchange, but from running it. Right, the dealer always wins. And in this Corn and Flour Exchange, and there are Corn and Flour Exchanges in every major eastern city where wheat is produced, this is where the wealthiest people come. In 1854, he turns towards banking, and he becomes a director of the Union Bank in Maryland. So Newcomer is at the center of two major changes. One is the switch from general merchandising to wholesaling, with new institutions and selling goods in large quantities, and then from wholesaling to exchanges. And these new institutions are what we associate with urban development. And even though industry doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. If you're an importer or a manufacturer, you can get goods to a much larger market. You'll specialize and try to drive out competitors by learning everything there is to know about your product, like Newcomer did in the 1840s. If you're a merchant like Newcomer, you'll increasingly turn away from speculating on the future price of goods and toward building financial institutions. Wholesaling. So what a wholesaler does is he makes deals, like Newcomer, he makes deals with farmers in the West. He buys hundreds and hundreds of bales bushels of flour, brings them in, bushels of wheat, brings them in to a warehouse and then resells them to other merchants. And so that's what the wholesaling business is basically buying and selling in very large quantities. Costco is a little bit like a wholesaler, right? You can't buy, just one thing of dishwasher detergent at a Costco. A wholesaler like Newcomer is selling mostly to other dealers and other grain merchants. So the two changes are the shift from general merchandise to specialized merchandise, and the shift from specialized merchandise into and wholesaling into exchanges. Right. That's why it's called Costco wholesale. The idea is that when you go to Costco, you bet it at the wholesale price. In fact, you pay a retail price, but they're in big lots. If you go to an actual wholesale grocery in any city, it's going to be larger than a Costco, and it's going to have tens of thousands of not that tens of thousands, thousands of boxes of milk and things like that, and you'll buy them in bulk and bring them to your grocery store. Okay. All right, and this is where we get a new class, I think, in the United States in between 1830 and 1850, and it's called the Brahmin class. And Brahmin is a word from India, and it refers to a particular class of people that were, had an inherited wealth and inherited power and inherited authority. This Brahmin class, as it's called, is the upper class, basically the New York, the Eastern upper class. While Newcomer himself started to work at 16, his sons would not. His sons would go straight to university. There's tremendous opportunity to make a living in the United States, but the wealthiest Americans control more and more of the nation's resources in this kind of environment. It's the highest caste, right? Is the Brahmin caste, and so through railroads, banks, and exchanges, we see the emergence of a small and incredibly wealthy group. These are mostly Protestants. They're entirely white. And they intermarry very frequently. The Boston Brahmins are called this in part because they represent a group of people that's ultimately going to be kind of family of very wealthy folks. They intermarry with other Brahmins. So the newcomer is very likely his wife is going to identify other, if they have both either sons or daughters, identify people that those people are going to marry. And sorry, no, not inbreeding, but intermarrying with other members of this elite class. That's the hope. Obviously, an arranged marriage is not always going to work out, but there are a lot of these sort of quasi-arranged marriages in this period. Women have a little bit more control. Young women have a little bit more control, but the expectation is the father is going to make the decision about who they get married to. And someone like Newcomer is only very likely to allow a daughter to marry someone who's also going to provide him connections to other people. Men and women together were critical in keeping money in the family. Sons were educated until there were 20 or so at the universities. So what percentage of Americans are educated in universities in the 1830s and 1840s? Less than 1%. Less than 1% of Americans are educated at universities in this period. And they are, by and large, the very wealthiest of folks. Okay? That's the Brahmin class, or the upper class. There's also a white-collar class, which is fairly large, much bigger in the North than in the South. They literally owned paper white collars that would be thrown away when they would get dirty, and that's why they're called the white-collar class. These are men who would work... right? There's a deep story here about that kid. They literally own paper white collars. The men would work as bookkeepers or secretaries in Newcomer's office, as tellers in his bank. These are the folks who might have the hopes of getting into the upper class by speculating on the flour and wheat exchanges or in the stock market. Many were the sons of artisans. Okay. We are all that kid. Tell me a little bit about... So I am fairly certain that kid is dead. Oh, no problem. This is, I think, it was a common genre. If a child died, the child would be brought to a camera studio. And before the child was put in the ground, the family would pose with them. right? And so this, I think the baby. Yes, I'm fairly certain that the child in the photo is dead. No, no worries, no worries. So this is a kind of death photo, and the reason photos are extremely expensive. But if someone lost a child, they would pose with the child before before they were put into the ground. Okay, so this is the white collar class, shoemakers. So many of these people who were in this middle class had the hopes of getting into the upper class by speculating on the flour and wheat exchanges. So the people who are speculating on the wheat exchanges might be someone like this fake Abe Lincoln looking guy on the left, someone who will have an extra $20 or $30 and might, if they think that wheat prices are going to go up, might buy contracts for wheat, or might, if he thinks wheat prices are going to go down, sell contracts for wheat. Many of them were the children of artisans, sons and daughters of artisans, shoemakers who couldn't make a go of it on their own, displaced by shoe factories that produced large quantities of food for of shoes for the hinterland market. They would their kids would go into these professions. They had trouble defining themselves. This middle class group. They didn't want to be workers, and that's why they had the white collars. These people, and newspapermen, another example of a sort of white collar class, besides secretaries, scriveners, and who else? Secretaries were mostly men, scriveners, and tellers, and basically retail workers and things like that. Most of the men in this period, and most of them with white collars. They made more than unskilled workers did, and they became a large market for hardcover and hardcover books, magazines, and newspapers. And so it's in this period that we see the real flowering of literature in this period. Now, how many of you have read The Scarlet Letter? Had to read The Scarlet Letter in undergrad? Sorry, in high school, junior, maybe middle school. Yes. Okay. There were foreign workers, and foreign workers were much more likely to end up in the sort of working class. And I'll talk about the working class in a minute. But this is the working class, and the working class was you knew them by their aprons. They would wear an apron. They did not wear a white collar. They were a much larger percentage of the population. But this working class were in the cities, and they tended more often to be immigrants. The middle class, though, were the consumers of these novels. Okay. So the Scarlet Letter, and so they became consumers of the literature that became known as the American Renaissance. American Renaissance. And the American Renaissance was designed for these middle class readers. Blue collar is basically it means that you just sweat enough that that you replaced you basically couldn't wear a white collar. The white collar showed that you didn't sweat at work. Like that's what the white collar represented. It showed that you were somebody who didn't need to use your hands, didn't need to or use your muscle to get work done. Okay, they became a huge market for these books. When works like Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and The House of Seven Gables. And The Scarlet Letter is what? What's the story in The Scarlet Letter? We've got Hester Prynne. What happens to Hester Prynne? Adultery, right? She sleeps with another man, a Puritan minister, and has to have a scarlet letter sewn on her breast because she's married but had a child with another man. Right. Exactly. The baby is almost taken from the mother, but the real father secretly intervenes. The original husband, who comes back under an assumed name, torments the father of the baby. The father, the minister, the Puritan minister, tears at his heart at night, scratching a wound right where the scarlet letter is. The father confesses after a sermon and dies on the spot. The original husband dies a year later. Okay. The story of the Scarlet Letter is a story about the nightmare of the middle class, right? It's set in the 1650s, but it's a story about what happens when you stray from the kind of expectations and plans of a middle class family. Well, right. So what's different, Frank, about this period is that there basically is unlimited immigration into the United States. The U.S. is anxiously searching for immigrants that are going to come in, and these are going to be this working class. There are lots of people who are born in the United States who become workers, but something like a third to a half are going to be relatively recent immigrants, 1830s to the 1850s. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, this is from the movie version of the thing, but she doesn't look so torn up. But she is torn up. She's torn up by grief and torn up um, her own sense that she's of her own adultery. Okay, so why does the middle? So another. Let me just explain another one. The House of Seven Gables, just to give you a sense. The House of Seven Gables is about two families: the Pynchons and the Maules. I'll spell that out. The Pynchon family and the Maule family. And one of the Maules, one of the Pynchons has a Maule hung as a wizard, okay, in the Puritan period. And the Maule guy who you see here is just about to be hung. I took the classic comics version of this, House of Seven Gables. He says, God will give him blood to drink just before he's hanged, the Maule. And the Maules will die with blood in their mouths. And as a result, or presumably, in the 1700s and the 1800s, the Pynchons die with blood in their mouths. Right, exactly. It's like I hadn't thought of that, but that may well be where Darth Maul comes from. Until the curse is broken, when a descendant from one family finds a descendant from another family, and they are reunited. Okay? In all our life, there can never come a moment like this, Phoebe. Is it all terror? Are you conscious of joy as I am? It seems a thin sin to think of joy now, she says. Could you but know, Phoebe, how it was with me the hour before you came, but you crossed the threshold and the black moment became a blissful one. I love you. Okay, so this is the romance. Both the Scarlet Letter and the House of Seven Gables are romances. Not in a traditional sense, although the House of Seven Gables is more or less about how one family meets another. So the Pynchons and the Maules get together at the end of this book, and the curse is lifted. This is so one thing that you should know is that the SAT verbal and the GRE verbal are basically a measure of how many 19th century English or 19th century novels you've read. The 19th century novels, all the language, all the literature, all the special words that you get in these 19th century novels end up being on the SAT and the GRE. Right. Okay. So the new market for these books is as Emily calls them, the knockoffs or ripoffs of Romeo and Juliet, are to middle class men and women. They worried about the family not keeping together. They worried about where the family was a resource to the upper class families. Middle class families that emulated were always in danger of overspending or overspeculating and being forced into the lower class. The tremendous mobility meant that they could go up, but that they could also go down. One false move, these books seem to preach, and you'll be spurned, lose your child, or die with blood in your mouth. The discussion of family inheritances also struck middle-class families where they lived. They lived through their children, obsessed with children, and understood that mistakes that could be passed on quite literally to their children. Sons in particular might never get through school and might never get the white collar. Oh, interesting. It hadn't occurred to me that there might be an anime version of the Scarlet Letter, but that makes sense. So these novels are the nightmare of the northern middle class. The real inroad for this literature was middle class women, particularly in the North. Much of it was written by women and read by women. Nathaniel Hawthorne hated the fact that the novels written by women were just as popular as his. He called them a damned mob of scribbling women. But he was writing to middle class men and women, but women especially, who worried about protecting their family, protecting their wealth, protecting their futures. Novels of this quality a lot of them get published, and much worse quality than House of Seven Gables or Scarlet Letter, which are the ones that we remember, and they're actually the best written, and among the best written of these. Publishers actually made much more money with the damn mob of scribbling women than they did with Nathaniel Hawthorne. The themes emphasized women's resources that can be found in the social circle of women of their own class. In general, they stress that women occupied a separate sphere. Not the brutal world of commerce, they defended honor of the home. These were responsible for making their sons into responsible citizens. These and women's magazines taught women that if they tried hard enough, that a stable family life was possible. At the time, many political leaders felt that this literature didn't matter. These were just novels, not the real stuff. Politics, men against men. This is going to be important in the 1840s and 50s because these novels, which are written off and ignored by both political parties, are going to be tremendously powerful in the 1850s. The theme of the novels fits the fears and anxieties of a new middle class, worries about falling into disgrace, fear of not passing your class onto your children. And now the working class that Frank was asking about. The working class, many of these people were immigrants or people who were excluded from the middle class. Irish or free blacks would be more often in these cities and would be in a working class. Excluded from many jobs, they formed their own associations, usually out of churches. For Irish men and women, for free black men and women, there were opportunities as ministers. For Irish men and women, there were opportunities as priests or nuns. And these priests or nuns acted as spokespeople for Irish workers. In the Irish potato famine of 1845 and 1846, there are tens of thousands of poor Irish people that end up in New York and Philadelphia and Boston in this period. There are labor unions, but they're very small, and they tend to go up when so there are Coopers unions, but they're basically just in cities and towns, and there aren't very many of them. They don't last very long. Right, exactly. Okay, so the working class, there are two secular. So urban workers will be workers for life. They will not get the white collar. And they will become a mass market for another kind of literature. Not the hardcover novels and not the magazines. They'll be a mass market for what are called the penny press and dime novels. Penny press and dime novels are very different from the sort of American Renaissance writers in this period. The dime novels focus on the daring exploits of backwoods men fighting Indians. They focus on the horrors of the Catholic Church. This image on the right, this book on the right, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, is a story about let me see if I can find it. I don't have it. Bear with me here for a second. So the Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk are about, or the subtitle was The Hidden Secrets of a Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed, claimed to expose systematic sexual abuse of nuns and infanticide in the Catholic Church, and this was supposedly set in Montreal. This was the most popular novel of the 1830s and 1840s, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. which is, it's hard to explain. It just goes on and on and on about the sort of torture of these women, the rape of these women. It's a strange genre, largely designed for Protestants, and it was the kind of thing for, that for men anyways, would be read with one hand, I guess. Not to go into more detail, but these are this is the kind of novels that were very popular. The penny press were newspapers that were literally a penny for the day, for the 8-page newspapers that came out. Okay, so these are this is the kind of system that we see emerging in the North. Right, is connected to grain. We see backward and forward linkages. Backward linkages in the provision of plows, nails, fertilizer, and clothing. Forward linkages in wheat exchanges, flour mills, bakeries, and distilleries and restaurants in cities. And what we see is the growth of large cities. We see the growth of a Brahmin class, an upper class, the growth of a large middle class, and the growth of a large working class. What we see in the South is very different. In part, that's because of cotton. And in large part, that's because of slavery. Okay. So let's talk about cotton, first of all. Cotton has backward and forward linkages too. All right. And in some ways, the backward linkages look very similar to for cotton. There would be plows, there would be nails, there would be fertilizer. But clothing and shoes and things like that, there would be there would not be people on the eastern coast, say in New Orleans or in Richmond or in Charleston, who would set up stores in the West to sell things to farmers, in large part because of plantation agriculture. Plantation agriculture had only one buyer for a group of, say, 50 or 100 people. Rather than having 20 or 30 family buyers who'd be available to buy from a store, you wouldn't have the same number of backward linkages, and there'd be relatively few goods that would come. Certainly plows would be needed, certainly fertilizer would be needed, and nails, but for things like clothing, for things like shoes, for those sorts of goods, for things like food, there might be pork barrels that would come to those places, but relatively little other kinds of food. The forward linkages for cotton are things like cotton pressing. That's turning cotton into the big bales that could be shipped abroad. Cotton mills, but those were mostly outside of the South, and clothing manufacture, which was also outside of the South. So let's look at the difference in backward and forward linkages, and I think this helps us understand some of the differences between North and South. So, in the North, we see most households are one buyer and about 4 producers. This would be a family of about 4 or 5 people. And in a universe of about 150 people, that would be about 37 buyers and 37 sellers, right? Something like that. For 150 people, you'd have 37 buyers and 37 sellers of goods. And that would mean that you could have stores in those back countries. So in a place like, let's say, a town you'd never heard of west of Philadelphia, or a town you'd never heard of in the hinterland of Baltimore or Boston, you would have multiple competing stores that would be bringing goods from the east to the west. Does that make sense? So that would be where you'd get your supplies for nails, for pork barrels, for thread and needle, for those sorts of things. You'd have multiple competing stores. But in the South, where plantation agriculture is more important, you'd have, for a universe of about 150, only 10 buyers and sellers. Some of them would be independent farmers, but on plantations, there'd only be one buyer or seller, and that would be the plantation owner. And so, if we look at this, we're going to see relatively few stores. Well, what does that mean? That means that railroads in the South aren't going to work. Why? Because railroads that go from the east to the west need to have goods that come, you need to have goods that go from the west to the east. And in the north, that would be wheat. In the South, that would be cotton. So those are the goods, the hinterland goods that are flowing from west to east. But you also need to have goods that go from the east to the west, like like um, like clothing, like nails, like pork barrels, the other backward linkages, fertilizer and clothing and things like that. As a result, railroads failed in the South again and again. Railroads would be built or proposed and started, but it cost so much because the railroad cars would go back empty. They would go from west to east to bring the goods, but they went back from east to west empty. And as a result, railroads were started and failed again and again and again in the South in the 1840s and 1850s. And largely because there aren't enough backward linkages. There aren't enough goods that need to flow back to make the railroad profitable. Does that make sense? So railroads have to send goods in two directions, but the railroads don't work in the South because they're not sending enough back. It's cost too much to send the goods back, out to the east with the goods, with the cotton, and then back with those other goods. It's not that slaveholders aren't buying goods; they are buying things, but they're buying them once a year, by and large, when the cotton comes in. And they don't need regular markets and they don't need regular stores. So right. And so that's why the North had so many more railroads during the Civil War. And that's why the North had bigger cities during the Civil War. Before the Civil War, is northern cities got bigger because of those backward and forward linkages. They got bigger because of the corn and flour exchanges that existed on the east. They got bigger because of the banking and other facilities that form in the east. They got bigger because there's many more kind of middle class that can be supported by the backward and forward linkages. Cities in the South, by comparison, like New Orleans, like Richmond, the biggest cities in the South fall behind the biggest cities in the North. So the difference is not industrialization so much as what you do with the agriculture and the fact that plantation agriculture doesn't have strong backward linkages. Okay, so the plantation structure has many families, but only one buyer. The fact that there's not a cash economy inside the plantation means that railroads ultimately fail. What that's going to mean economically is a real difference, a growing difference between the wheat regions and the cotton regions. Between superheated economic growth and a strong middle class in the North and slower economic growth and almost absent middle class, or a very tiny middle class in the South. There's still going to be a kind of upper class in the South. Those are going to be the plantation owners, but there's not going to be a kind of urban upper class like you see in places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston. That tension is going to be important for understanding the coming of the Civil War. Both that tension and novels. We'll talk about novels next time. Okay, bear with me. I didn't realize that we were going to have class. We were not going to have class on Thursday. So let me just see if I can do a quiz. I would have done it on Thursday, but let me just see. Okay, I think I'll do the quiz later. I won't say when, but I think I'll hold off on the quiz if that's okay with you guys. Yeah, let me hold off on the quiz. I won't, since we're not going to have class on Thursday. There's a good chance it'll be next week. I don't want to crowd quizzes and exams too close together. Are there questions about this setup? How the backward and forward linkages sharpen differences between the North and the South from the 1830s to the 1850s. Yeah. So this is the cotton backward and forward linkages. Sorry, this is the wheat backward and forward linkages. And so what we see are plows, nails, fertilizer, and clothing, and basically full trains going from the east to the west. And we see with the forward linkages lots more development, lots more opportunity for taking wheat and turning it into other things. And then the cotton, what we see are, you do need plows, but there's limited demand and only once a year. Nails and fertilizer. And actually I have 2 times a year, but I think that this is only once a year by and large. This would be when the cotton comes in, that clothing would be bought. So there's limited demand, and the goods are mostly flowing back only once a year. And that's important because railroads can't succeed in that environment. Railroads have to go back and forth. They can't leave. They can't return with empty railroad cars. And as a result, railroads that they attempt to build in the South fail. The only railroads that are built in the South, and there are a few, they're heavily subsidized by the state. So there's railroads in Virginia, like the Richmond and Danville Railroad, but it stops right at the Virginia border because it's supported by the state of Virginia. Over 50% of the stock is owned by the state of Virginia, and so it's designed just for Virginia. The South Carolina Railroad starts in Charleston and goes back up to, goes to almost, well, it doesn't go that far back. It goes to Columbia, from Charleston to Columbia, South Carolina. But it's constantly failing. It costs, 50% of the stock is owned by the state, and it's in constant need of infusions of cash, and it's very expensive to get goods back and forth over this railroad. The Georgia Central Railroad is built in this period from the 1830s to 1850s, but it too is constantly foundering and constantly needs more and more money from the state. That means that railroads in the South are going to be state railroads exclusively. Northern railroads, there are going to be a few more that cross state lines by the 1840s and 1850s. Yes, and so the plantation structure has many families, but only one buyer, and that would be the slave owner, the enslaver, right? The enslaver would be the buyer in that kind of environment. Now, not everybody in the South is on a plantation, right? There are some white farmers who just operate farms. There are some free black farmers who operate their own farms in the South. Not a whole lot, but there are some. But for plantations, there's only going to be one buyer. And so if we look at the layout of this system, we're going to see in a universe of 150 people, there are only going to be about 10 buyers and 10 sellers for every 150 people in the South. Yeah, we still will do Pack Back on Thursday. Ask you to do it sort of Wednesday or Friday, something like that. Other questions? Okay, I promise that the story of the novels and the story of the economic differences between the North and the South are going to come together soon. That in a certain sense, the novels that have been ignored by and large by the political parties that have been built on these patchwork coalitions, are ultimately going to collapse. Only one. No, please do the pack back for either tomorrow or on Friday or on Saturday, just to sort of make sure that you're caught up. Because I would like you to respond to what other people asked for the reading.